What if everything you thought you knew about marriage was a lie? What if the ancient world's most sacred union, wrapped in vows, veils, and ceremony, was never about love, but power? Beneath the polished stones of history lie 25 marriage customs built on control, manipulation, and quiet violence. Traditions scrubbed clean and buried for millennia. Tonight, we dig beneath the surface to expose the truth. This isn't a scandal. It's a pattern. Welcome, seekers of the forbidden. If you crave the hidden and the unsettling, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe so you never miss another dark dive into the past. And drop a comment. Midnight in Cairo, sunrise in Sydney, somewhere you shouldn't be awake. Let's step into the shadows together. Imagine a union so sacred that it blurred the line between family and deity. A marriage that was never about love, but survival. The sun beats down on Thebes, circa 1550 BCE. Inside the palace walls, a young princess, barely 15, prepares for her wedding day. She wears the finest linen, adorned with gold and lapis lazuli. Her skin is painted with kohl and oils that shimmer in the lamplight. But the man she's about to marry isn't a foreign prince or a powerful nobleman. He's her brother. The ancient Egyptians didn't stumble into this practice by accident. Royal incest was deliberate, calculated, and defended as divine law. The pharaohs believed themselves to be living gods, descendants of Ra himself. To maintain that divine bloodline, to keep the power of the gods concentrated within the royal family, they married their siblings, their half-siblings, sometimes even their own children. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. Take Tutankhamun, perhaps Egypt's most famous pharaoh. DNA analysis of his mummy, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2010, confirmed what Egyptologists had long suspected. His parents were full siblings. The genetic consequences were catastrophic. Tutankhamun suffered from multiple disorders: a clubfoot, a cleft palate, scoliosis, and a compromised immune system. He died at 19, his body ravaged by the very purity his lineage sought to preserve. But he wasn't unique. Cleopatra VII, yes, that Cleopatra, was the product of at least 3 generations of sibling marriages. Her parents were siblings. Her grandparents were siblings. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, practiced brother-sister marriage so consistently that their family tree barely branches. It's nearly a straight line, generation after generation, doubling back on itself in a genetic nightmare. The hieroglyphic inscriptions don't hide this practice. They celebrate it. In the Temple of Karnak, royal marriage contracts describe unions between brothers and sisters as keeping the bloodline pure for the gods. One inscription from the reign of Amenhotep III describes his marriage to his own daughter, Sitamun, as a sacred duty to maintain the divine essence of the throne. Here's what the history books often gloss over. These weren't consensual unions between equals. The princesses had no choice. They were raised from birth knowing their fate, to marry their brothers, to bear children who might be deformed or stillborn, to sacrifice their bodies and their futures for an abstract concept of divine purity that served only to concentrate power within a single family. The priests knew the truth. Medical papyri from ancient Egypt describe treatments for the kinds of genetic disorders that would have been common in these incestuous bloodlines: birth defects, stillbirths, infant mortality rates that would have been staggering even by ancient standards. But the practice continued for thousands of years because it wasn't really about the gods at all. It was about power, pure, undiluted, unshared power. For centuries, we were told this was divinely ordained, a mysterious practice of a civilization we could never truly understand. But what if it was just a twisted game for ultimate power? What if every religious justification was simply a cover for the most basic of human drives, the refusal to share control? And Egypt wasn't the only civilization that had its own dark take on marriage, not even close. In Sparta, marriage wasn't about love. It was about military strength, and the way they built warriors. It started with their wives. The year is roughly 480 BCE. In a stone dwelling in Sparta, a young woman, 18 years old, muscled and athletic, from years of state-mandated physical training, prepares for her wedding night. But there's no ceremony, no celebration, no gathering of family. Instead, her head is shaved. She's dressed in men's clothing, and she's left alone in a dark room to wait for a man she may have never spoken to. The groom arrives in secret, having snuck away from his military barracks. The encounter is brief, furtive, almost violent. Then he leaves, returning to his barracks before dawn. This pattern might continue for years. Secret meetings in the dark, no emotional connection, no partnership, just biological function in service of the state. This was marriage in Sparta, and it was unlike anything else in the ancient Greek world. The Spartan system was designed by Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, around 700 BCE. His goal wasn't to create happy families, it was to create perfect soldiers. And that started with eugenics. According to Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, written in the 1st century CE but drawing on much older sources, Spartan marriage was explicitly designed to produce strong offspring. Young women weren't married until they were physically mature, 18 or older, ancient by Greek standards. But this wasn't out of concern for their well-being. It was because the Spartans believed that physically mature women would produce stronger children. The women were put through rigorous physical training, not to empower them, but to turn them into breeding stock for the warrior class. Here's where it gets darker. Plutarch describes a practice called wife sharing. If an older Spartan man had a young, fertile wife, he was encouraged to loan her to a younger, more physically impressive warrior to father children. The resulting offspring would belong to the older man, but the genetic material came from the prime physical specimen. The woman's consent? Never mentioned. Her desires? Irrelevant. She was a resource to be allocated by the state. The wedding night ritual, the shaved head, the men's clothing, wasn't romantic tradition. Modern historians, including Paul Cartledge in his comprehensive study, The Spartans, the World of the Warrior Heroes of Ancient Greece, interpret this as a deliberate attempt to ease young men, who had spent their entire lives in all-male military barracks, into heterosexual intercourse. The woman was made to look as much like a young boy as possible, and it worked, sort of. Sparta produced some of ancient Greece's finest warriors. But at what cost? The Spartan population was notoriously small and constantly declining. Birth rates were low, infant mortality was high, partly because Spartan law mandated that any infant deemed weak or deformed be left to die on Mount Taygetus. One Spartan woman, according to an anecdote preserved by Plutarch, was asked by a foreign woman, "Why are you Spartan women the only ones who can rule men?" Her response, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to men." It sounds like pride, but read it again. It's the voice of someone who knows her only value is as a vessel for producing soldiers. What they didn't tell you is that love was never the point. The future of the state was everything, and human desire meant nothing at all. But marriage in ancient civilizations was often tied to even more perverse practices, far darker than we can imagine. In ancient Mesopotamia, marriage didn't always start with a vow. It began with a death. The royal cemetery of Ur, southern Iraq, circa 2600 BCE. British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating in the 1920s, discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a massive death pit adjacent to the tomb of a Sumerian king, he found the remains of 74 people, soldiers, musicians, servants, and 6 women wearing elaborate headdresses of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. These weren't servants, they were brides. The practice Woolley uncovered was a form of death marriage, women of noble birth selected to accompany Sumerian kings into the afterlife. But these weren't widows volunteering to follow their beloved husbands into death. Many of these women had never met the kings they were married to. The marriage ceremony happened post-mortem, a ritual union between a living woman and a dead man, followed immediately by her execution. The cuneiform tablets recovered from Ur describe the ritual in chilling detail. The women were chosen for their beauty and their noble lineage. Their families received compensation, essentially a bride price for a marriage that would last only hours. They were dressed in their finest clothes, adorned with jewelry that would be buried with them. Then they were led into the death pit, given wine mixed with poison, and arranged in their final positions before consciousness faded. But why? The official religious explanation was that these great kings needed companions in the afterlife. They needed servants, entertainers, and wives to maintain their royal status in the world of the dead. It was considered a great honor to be chosen. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. Chemical analysis of the remains, conducted by researchers at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in the 2000s, revealed that many of the bodies showed signs of trauma consistent with violent death, not peaceful poisoning, but blunt force trauma to the head. Some appeared to have been struck from behind while they knelt. Others showed signs of struggle. One skeleton in particular, identified as a young woman between 18 and 25 years old, had her hands raised defensively in front of her skull. She saw it coming. In her final moment, she tried to protect herself. The tablets also reveal something else. This practice wasn't limited to royal burials. Wealthy merchants and nobles adopted the tradition on a smaller scale. One tablet, dated to around 2400 BCE and currently housed in the British Museum, describes a merchant named Ur-Nanshe who took a bride in death for his father's funeral. A young woman from a poor family, purchased for the equivalent of 30 bushels of grain. Think about that. 30 bushels of grain for a human life, for a woman who would be dressed up, married to a corpse, and killed on the same day. The practice seems to have died out around 2000 BCE, not because the Sumerians suddenly developed a conscience, but because the economic cost became unsustainable. Sacrificing dozens of people for a single burial meant removing them from the workforce, from reproduction, from economic productivity. The practice ended not out of morality, but because it became inefficient. What if this wasn't about the gods, but about the power of life over death? The ultimate display of control, to decree that others should follow you into the grave, that your death should not be a solitary passage but a mass event that demonstrated your power over life itself. The chilling truth is buried in those tombs, in the mass graves, in the bones of women who wore their wedding jewelry to their execution. And as shocking as this is, it was just a precursor to even darker practices. In Rome, marriage was a transaction, and the brides were nothing more than property. Picture Rome, 150 BCE. In the Forum, beneath the shadow of the Temple of Saturn, a young girl, 12 years old, stands beside her father. She's dressed in a yellow veil, the flammium, wearing shoes dyed red with animal blood. Her father is negotiating with a potential husband, a man 40 years old, a senator with political ambitions. They're not discussing her education, her interests, her dreams. They're discussing her dowry and the political alliance this marriage will cement. The girl's opinion is never asked. Her consent is never required. Roman law is explicit. Patria potestas, the power of the father, means she is his property until she becomes her husband's property. That's the transaction happening in the Forum, a transfer of ownership. Roman marriage, particularly among the upper classes, was shockingly transactional. The legal texts are brutally clear. In the Institutes of Gaius, a legal textbook from the 2nd century CE, marriage is described as one of the ways a man acquires manus, literally hand, meaning legal control, over a woman. She passes from her father's hand to her husband's hand like any other asset. Cicero, in his letters to Atticus, discusses his daughter Tullia's marriages with the same tone he uses to discuss property investments. When Tullia's first husband dies, Cicero immediately begins negotiations for her remarriage, not out of concern for her grief or her emotional state, but because an unmarried daughter of marriageable age was a wasted political opportunity. When Tullia wanted to divorce her second husband because he was abusive, Cicero's response, preserved in his letters, was essentially, "But the political alliance is useful." The marriage ceremony itself reinforced this transactional nature. The confariatio, the most formal type of Roman marriage, involved the bride and groom sharing a cake made of spelt in front of 10 witnesses and the Pontifex Maximus. Sounds almost quaint until you read the words of the ceremony, preserved in the writings of Gaius. Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. The woman literally takes a generic form of her husband's name. She loses her individual identity in the legal text of the ceremony. But the truly dark aspect of Roman marriage was the practice of sine manu marriage combined with easy divorce. At least, easy for the man. A Roman man could divorce his wife simply by saying, "Tuas res tibi habeto." Keep your things for yourself. That's it. Marriage dissolved in a single sentence. No legal process, no justification required. This led to a marriage marketplace unlike anything before it. Wealthy Romans would cycle through marriages based on political convenience. Pompey the Great was married 5 times. His third wife, Mucia, he divorced in a letter while he was on military campaign. She learned her marriage was over from a messenger. His fourth wife was Julia, Julius Caesar's daughter, married to him as part of the first triumvirate political alliance. When she died in childbirth, the political alliance began to crumble. Marriage and politics were inseparable. For women, this meant living in constant uncertainty. You could be married off at 12, divorced at 15 when the political winds shifted, remarried at 16 to someone else. The Roman writer Seneca described one woman who had married and divorced 8 times by age 30. He didn't describe this as scandalous. It was just how the system worked. What the history books fail to mention is that for women, marriage wasn't a promise. It was a business deal that could be terminated at any moment, leaving them without support, without status, without protection. And in Rome, a woman without a legal guardian had almost no rights at all. But the power dynamics of marriage weren't just confined to the royals or the elite. They existed at every level of ancient society. In the harsh world of the Vikings, marriage was a battlefield, and not all warriors fought for love. The longhouse is cold even with the fire burning. Outside, snow falls on the Norwegian coast, circa 870 CE. Inside, a young woman, 16 years old, daughter of a minor jarl, sits in silence as her father and a visiting chieftain negotiate the terms of her marriage. She knows better than to speak. In Viking society, her role in this negotiation is the same as the role of the horses and land being discussed. She is an asset to be traded. Viking marriage was fundamentally a property arrangement, and the Old Norse legal codes make this brutally explicit. The Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code that preserved much older Viking-era traditions, treats marriage as a contractual transfer. The groom paid a bride price, munder, to the bride's family, not to the bride herself. In exchange, he received full legal authority over her. But here's what makes Viking marriage particularly dark: the prevalence of forced marriages and abductions. The sagas, the Old Norse prose narratives that, while partly mythologized, contain kernels of historical truth, are full of stories of women taken in raids, captured from rival clans, or seized as war booty. Laxdæla Saga, one of the most famous Icelandic sagas, tells the story of Melkorka, an Irish princess who was captured by Viking raiders as a teenager and sold into slavery in Iceland. Eventually, she became the concubine, a legal status in Norse society, somewhere between wife and slave, of a wealthy Icelander named Höskuldur. The saga treats this as a romantic story of a slave who eventually revealed her noble birth. Read it again. It's a story of a kidnapped teenage girl forced into a sexual relationship with her captor, with no agency whatsoever. The archaeological evidence supports this disturbing pattern. A 2020 genetic study published in the journal Nature examined the DNA of Viking Age remains from Iceland. The researchers found that while the male settlers were predominantly Scandinavian, the female population showed a high percentage of Celtic ancestry, specifically from Ireland and Scotland. The most likely explanation? Mass abduction of women during Viking raids. These weren't voluntary migrations. These were women taken from their homes, transported across the North Sea, and forced into marriages or concubinage. Some of the skeletal remains show evidence of healed fractures and other trauma consistent with violent capture. The legal codes even had provisions for dealing with captured women. According to the Gragas, a man who captured a woman in a raid had legal claim to her as property. He could marry her, sell her, or keep her as a slave. The woman's consent was never part of the legal calculation. Viking women who weren't captured faced their own constraints. The Fridla, the formal bride, had more legal protections than a concubine or slave, but she was still under her husband's legal authority. He controlled her property, her movements, her relationships. If he died, she passed to the authority of his male relatives or back to her own father or brothers. One of the most chilling details comes from the Íslendingabók, Book of the Icelanders, written in the 12th century but describing earlier traditions. It mentions that when Iceland was first settled in the 9th century, many of the Norwegian settlers took wives from Ireland and Scotland. The word used, taka, to take, is the same word used for taking property or plunder, not gift ask, to marry in mutual agreement, but taka, take. A runic inscription from Norway, dated to around 900 CE, reads, Erlinger raised this stone in memory of Bjorn, his son, who took women across the sea. Not married, took. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about survival, about political alliances, about acquiring women the same way you acquired land or livestock. And when it came to survival, loyalty had its price, a price almost always paid by women who had no say in the transaction. The Vikings were far from the only ones to use marriage for power. Let's look at a civilization even older, where marriage customs were just as ruthless. In the heart of the mighty Babylon, some women weren't married. They were captured. Babylon, 1595 BCE, under the reign of King Samsu-iluna. The Kassite tribes have just been defeated in the northern territories, and the spoils of war are being distributed in the palace courtyard. Among the gold, the weapons, the livestock, stand 30 women, ranging in age from 13 to 25. They're being presented to Babylonian nobles and officers, not as servants, but as wives. This was the practice of taking captive brides, and it was deeply embedded in Mesopotamian culture. The Code of Hammurabi, that famous law code carved into stone around 1750 BCE and now residing in the Louvre, contains specific provisions for dealing with women captured in warfare. Law 1 of 28 states, if a man takes a woman to wife, but has no intercourse with her, this woman is no wife to him. Note what it doesn't say, anything about her consent. The Mari letters, a collection of nearly 25,000 cuneiform tablets discovered in 1933 at the ancient city of Mari in modern-day Syria, provide even more disturbing details. These administrative documents, dating from around 1800 BCE, include correspondence between Babylonian kings and their vassals discussing the distribution of captured women as diplomatic gifts and forced brides. One tablet, catalogued as Arm 10-9, describes how King Zimri-Lim received a gift of 20 women from a conquered city. The letter specifies their ages, most between 15 and 20, their physical condition, the king wanted assurance they were unspoiled, and their intended use, to be married off to palace officials as rewards for military service. These women had names. The tablet lists some of them, Kirum, Anatum, Bunitu. But their names didn't matter. They were prizes, rewards, political instruments. What makes this particularly chilling is the bureaucratic precision. The ancient Mesopotamians kept meticulous records, and those records show that this wasn't chaotic violence. It was systematized, organized, legally sanctioned trafficking of human beings under the veneer of marriage. The women captured in these conquests faced a specific trauma. They were torn from their homes, often witnessing the deaths of their families in the sieges. Then, they were marched to Babylon, assessed like livestock, and handed over to men who had possibly killed their fathers and brothers. And they were expected to be grateful because being selected as a wife rather than a common slave was considered a privilege. Archaeological evidence from the old Babylonian period shows that these forced marriages were common enough to have influenced Babylonian demographics. Skeletal remains from the era show a mixture of ethnic origins among the female population of Babylonian cities, while male remains are more homogeneous. The women came from everywhere: Elam, the Kassite territories, the northern regions. The men were Babylonian. One particularly haunting artifact is a clay tablet from around 1700 BCE discovered at Sipar and currently in the British Museum. It's a letter from a captured woman named Ahatum to her brother, who was apparently still alive in her home city. The tablet is damaged, but the readable portions say, "I am in the house of Ilubani. I am called his wife. I remember the gardens of home. Please send word that mother still lives." That's all we have. A fragment of a voice across 4,000 years, a woman trying to maintain some connection to her stolen life while living in the house of a man she was forced to call husband. What they called a marriage, these women knew as captivity. And the practice wasn't unique to Babylon. It was standard operating procedure across the ancient Near East. But the practice of political marriages didn't end there. In fact, in ancient Greece, it took on an even more overtly violent form. In ancient Greece, a woman's marriage could begin not with a proposal, but with abduction. The practice was called harpage, literally seizure or rape in ancient Greek, and it was particularly common among the Dorian Greeks of Crete and Sparta. But Before you think this was some rare, aberrant practice, understand this. It was so common that it became ritualized, incorporated into wedding ceremonies across the Greek world. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE in his Greek Questions, describes the Spartan wedding ritual in detail. The bride would be captured by the groom and his friends, seized often from her own home, carried away, and her head shaved by an older woman who then dressed her in men's clothing and left her on a straw mattress in a dark room. The groom would visit briefly, then return to his barracks. This capture was theatrical, yes, but it ritually reenacted actual practices of violent abduction. But the ritualized version masks something much darker that was still happening in parts of the Greek world. Herodotus, the 5th century BCE historian, describes in his histories how the Pelasgians, an early Greek people, conducted raids specifically to capture women for marriage. Book 6, chapter 138. The Pelasgians seized Athenian women at Brauron, celebrating a festival to Artemis, carried them off to Lemnos, and made them their concubines. This wasn't mythology, this was documented history. The archaeological record supports it. On the island of Lemnos, excavations have revealed mass graves from the 6th century BCE, containing the remains of women whose skeletal analysis, isotopic studies of teeth and bones, showed they originated from mainland Greece, not the island itself. Some showed signs of violent trauma. They were brought to Lemnos not by choice, but by force. The practice existed on a spectrum. On one end, ritualized abductions that were prearranged between families but maintained the symbolic violence of capture. On the other end, actual violent kidnappings of women from rival cities or lower status families. The Cretan Gymnopaidiae, an annual festival, included a competition where young men would attempt to capture young women. The winners got to marry their captors. Ancient sources present this as a charming athletic tradition. But read the details. The women had no say in participation, no right to refuse their captors, no legal recourse if they were injured during the game. One particularly disturbing account comes from Athenaeus's De Hypnose Sophistae, written in the 3rd century CE but citing much earlier sources. He describes how in certain Greek cities, young men would form raiding parties to kidnap women from neighboring territories. These women, called demoi or dimoloi, captured, were considered legitimate wives once the marriage was consummated, regardless of their consent. The law recognized marriage by capture as legally binding. Think about what that means. A woman could be grabbed from her home, raped, and then the legal system would say, well, she's married now. The violence that initiated the relationship was transformed by law into a legitimate bond. The philosopher Plato, in Laws, Book 6, even discusses the ideal age for taking a wife, noting that men should marry between 30 and 35, while women should be between 16 and 20. He uses laban, to take, to seize, not gamian, to marry in mutual agreement. The language reveals the assumption. Marriage was something men did to women, not with them. We find echoes of this in Greek mythology, of course. The rape of Persephone, the abduction of Helen, the seizure of the Sabine women, that last one Roman, but influenced by Greek traditions. These myths weren't warnings against such behavior. They were cultural narratives that normalized violence against women as the foundation of marriage. They called it marriage, but what if it was just a pretext for theft and violence? What if the romantic language of capturing hearts had much more literal and much darker origins? The practice was not confined to Greece, though. It was common across the ancient world, including civilizations that would make the Greeks look almost civilized by comparison. In the Maya civilization, some women didn't just marry, they were sacrificed in a union to the gods. Tikal, Guatemala, circa 750 CE during the late Classic period. A young woman, 18 years old, selected for her beauty and her noble lineage, stands at the top of Temple 2, the Temple of the Masks. She wears a huipil woven with sacred symbols, her wrists and ankles adorned with jade. Below her, thousands of Maya citizens watch in the Grand Plaza. She is about to be married, and then she is about to die. This was the practice of divine marriage followed by sacrifice, documented in Maya codices, ceramic paintings, and, most hauntingly, in the archaeological evidence from the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Maya books, written sometime before the Spanish conquest, contains detailed images of marriage ceremonies that culminate in ritual sacrifice. On page 3, a woman is shown dressed in bridal regalia, standing before a priest. In the next panel, she's depicted in the act of sacrifice, heart extraction, the most sacred form of Maya religious killing, but the real evidence comes from bones. Edward Thompson, dredging the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza in the early 1900s, pulled up the remains of over 200 individuals. Modern reanalysis of these remains, conducted by the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology and History in the 1990s, revealed something chilling. Approximately half were young women between the ages of 15 and 25. Many wore the remains of elaborate jewelry, jade beads, gold ornaments, ceremonial pieces far too valuable to throw away casually. These women weren't criminals. They weren't prisoners of war. Those were typically adult males. They were offerings, and many appeared to have been part of marriage ceremonies. How do we know? The Maya left written records on their pottery. A polychrome vase currently in the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, dated to around 700 CE, depicts a marriage ceremony labeled with hieroglyphic text. The text reads, translated by epigrapher David Stewart, "The young woman Ixchak is given to the god Chak in marriage that the rains may come." The scene shows a woman in bridal dress approaching a sacrificial altar. This wasn't about love. This was transaction theology. The Maya believed that the gods required payment for their blessings, rain for crops, victory in war, fertility of the land. And what greater payment than the life of a beautiful young woman offered not just as a sacrifice but as a divine bride. Bishop Diego de Landa, the Spanish priest who arrived in the Yucatan in 1549, documented, while simultaneously trying to destroy, Maya practices. His Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán describes the marriage sacrifice ceremonies. They took the daughters of nobles, dressed them as brides, and offered them to Chak or to Kukulkan, that the gods might take them as wives. Landa was horrified, but he also noted that the Maya families considered this an honor. To have your daughter selected as a divine bride was a sign of the gods' favor. The girls themselves left no written record of their feelings. But we have their bones. Forensic analysis shows that many of the young women from the cenote had stress fractures in their limbs, evidence of having been restrained. Some showed defensive wounds on their hands and forearms. Not all of them went willingly to their divine marriages. One skeleton in particular haunts the archaeological record. Excavated from a tomb beneath structure 5D73 at Tikal in 1962, she was approximately 17 years old when she died. She was buried in full bridal regalia, the finest textiles, the remains of which still showed traces of red dye, jade jewelry, ceremonial headdress. But her skull showed evidence of a single blow from behind, the classic method of sacrificial execution. The burial context suggests she was married to the temple deity and then immediately killed, her body interred in the sacred space as the eternal bride of the god, a marriage to the gods, but only in death. And while the Maya practiced these brutal rites, other American civilizations had even more twisted customs. In the land of the Incas, marriage didn't begin with vows. It began with the sun. Cusco, Peru, 1470 CE. The Sapa Inca Tupac Yupanqui sits on his throne in the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun. Beside him stands his new wife, his full sister, Mama Ocullo. She is 14 years old. This is not a scandal. This is the law. The Inca emperors practiced mandatory royal incest on a scale that would have impressed even the Ptolemies of Egypt. But where the Egyptian practice declined over centuries, the Inca formalized it, systematized it, made it the absolute law of the empire. The Sapa Inca, the emperor considered the direct descendant of the sun, god Inti, was required by religious law to marry his full sister. Not a half-sister, not a cousin, but his full sibling. This marriage produced the heir to the throne, who would in turn marry his full sister. The genetic consequences were catastrophic. Though the Inca kept no written records, they used quipu, knotted strings, which don't preserve genetic speculation. But the Spanish chroniclers who arrived in the 16th century documented what they found: Pedro Cieza de Leon, writing in Chronicle of Peru, 1553, described the royal family. Many of the Inca children were born with defects, some unable to walk properly, others simple-minded, and still others died before reaching adulthood. The mummies tell the story more clearly. When the Spanish conquistadors looted the royal mausoleums of Cusco, they found generations of Inca emperors and their sister wives preserved in the Andean cold. Modern studies of these mummies, those that survived into the modern era, show evidence of genetic disorders consistent with repeated inbreeding. Bone malformations, dental anomalies, shortened lifespans. But here's the truly dark part. This practice wasn't limited to the emperor. Inca nobility, the Ilis or royal families, were encouraged to marry within their own families to maintain blood purity. The more closely related you were to your spouse, the higher your status. Marriage to a first cousin was common among the nobility. Marriage to a sibling was the ultimate status symbol, and the women, they had no choice whatsoever. The Spanish chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega, himself the son of an Inca princess and a Spanish conquistador, wrote in Royal Commentaries of the Incas, 1609. The daughters of the Inca were raised knowing from birth that they would marry their brothers. They were taught that this was the will of the sun, and to refuse was to refuse the god himself. Young Inca princesses were kept in near isolation, seeing only family members and specifically designated servants. They were educated in weaving, in religious rites, in how to be perfect vessels for the royal bloodline. But they were never asked if they wanted this life. The question was irrelevant. One particularly haunting detail comes from the Capacocha sacrifices, the ritual sacrifices of children to the mountain gods. Archaeological discoveries in the Andes since the 1990s have revealed several frozen mummies of children, perfectly preserved by the cold and dry air. Some were as young as 6, others as old as 15. What makes this relevant to marriage customs? Many of these sacrificial victims were the children of incestuous royal marriages, specifically selected for sacrifice because of their pure bloodline. A 1999 discovery on Mount Lulailico, detailed in the journal National Geographic, found 3 child mummies. The oldest, a girl about 15, showed evidence of being fattened up for months before her death, given special foods and coca leaves to dull her awareness. Analysis of her hair showed she'd been selected for sacrifice at least a year before her death. She was dressed in fine textiles, wearing a silver pin that marked her as royalty. The genetic analysis, high levels of homozygosity, the signature of inbreeding. She was the product of an incestuous royal marriage, raised in luxury, and then killed as the ultimate offering to the gods. Her life, from conception to death, shaped entirely by a system that valued bloodline purity above all else, including human well-being. What if this wasn't divine, but something much darker? An effort to create a dynasty built on genetic manipulation and the sacrifice of agency, health, and sometimes life itself. These incestuous unions weren't limited to royalty. Other ancient cultures practiced similar customs, often with equally devastating results. In China, marriage didn't always mean a wedding. It sometimes meant an alliance in the shadows. Chang'an, the capital of the Tang dynasty, 720 CE. In a small courtyard within the imperial palace complex, a ceremony is taking place. There's no grand celebration, no guests, no formal recognition. A young woman, 15 years old, daughter of a minor official, is being married to a man she has never met and will rarely see. He is a Naishi, an imperial eunuch, one of the emperor's most trusted advisors. This is a shadow marriage, and she is about to disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of the Chinese imperial court. The practice of marrying women to imperial eunuchs was common throughout Chinese dynastic history, particularly during the Tang and Ming dynasties. These were not marriages in any meaningful sense. They were political arrangements designed to bind powerful officials to the emperor through familial ties, while ensuring those officials could never produce heirs that might threaten the imperial line. The Old Book of Tang, Jutang Shu, the official history of the Tang dynasty compiled in 945 CE, contains numerous entries describing these arrangements. One entry from the reign of Emperor Xuanzong reads, "The eunuch Gao Lishi was given in marriage to the daughter of the vice minister of revenue. The emperor commanded this to ensure Gao's loyalty, and to provide him with proper household management. Read that again. The emperor commanded this marriage. The young woman's father, being a mid-level bureaucrat, could not refuse an imperial decree. His daughter became the wife of a eunuch, a man who had been castrated, often as a child, to serve in the palace. There would be no physical relationship, no children, no normal marital life. She would manage his household, attend to his needs, and live in a state of permanent liminal existence. Married, but not really married. These women were called yinu, shadow women, because they lived in the shadows of power without ever wielding it themselves. They weren't concubines. Those belonged to the emperor and princes. They weren't regular wives. Those belonged to men who could continue their family lines. They existed in a strange legal category, acknowledged enough to be bound by marital law, but invisible enough that history barely recorded their names. The veritable records of the Ming dynasty contains even more detailed accounts. During the reign of the Yongle Emperor, 1402-1424, the practice became systematized. Eunuchs of certain ranks were entitled, or rather required, to take wives from designated families. These families, often fallen nobility, or the daughters of minor officials in political disfavor, had little choice but to comply. One account, dated to 1411, describes a young woman named Wei Shi, daughter of a disgraced official, who was married to the powerful eunuch Wang Zhen. The record notes that Wei Shi entered Wang's household and was never seen in public again. That's the entire entry, a life summarized in a single bureaucratic sentence. Archaeological evidence from Ming Dynasty eunuch tombs reveals the reality of these shadow marriages. Excavations of the tomb of the eunuch Liu Jin in 2006 uncovered not only his remains, but also those of a woman buried in an adjacent chamber, presumably his wife. Analysis of her skeleton showed she died in her early 20s. Her teeth showed evidence of poor nutrition in her final years. Her grave goods were minimal, a few pieces of simple pottery, none of the jewelry or valuables a woman of her apparent social class should have possessed. She lived in the household of one of the Ming Dynasty's most powerful eunuchs, a man who controlled access to the emperor, who amassed a fortune in bribes and gifts. Yet she was buried like a servant. The practice wasn't limited to eunuchs. Shadow marriages existed throughout the Chinese imperial bureaucracy. Daughters of conquered peoples, of disgraced officials, of families in political disfavor, were routinely married to imperial functionaries as a means of control. These marriages signaled the emperor's power to command personal relationships, to dictate the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives. A late Tang Dynasty poem by an unknown woman, discovered on a fragment of silk in the Mogao caves, reads, "Married to a shadow man, I keep his empty house. My father pleased the throne, I pay the price." They called them wives, but no one knew their names. Their legacy was lost in the silence. Their lives measured only by their utility to men who could not father children, who could not continue bloodlines, who existed only to serve an emperor's will. But what about those marriages designed for conquest? Marriages that left no room for the woman at all? In the lands of the Hittites, marriage wasn't just about family, it was about a price tag. Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, 1450 BCE. In a stone building near the Great Temple, a transaction is being negotiated. Two fathers sit across from each other, and between them, a scribe records the terms in cuneiform on a clay tablet. They're discussing sheep, 90 of them to be precise, plus 20 measures of grain, 3 bronze cauldrons, and 2 milk cows. They're not discussing livestock management. They're negotiating a bride price for a 14-year-old girl who sits silently in the next room, waiting to learn who will purchase her. The Hittite laws, a collection of legal codes carved in stone and preserved in clay tablets from the 14th century BCE, are explicit about bride prices. Law, 28 states, if a man takes a woman in marriage, he shall give the bride price to her father. Law 29 specifies the amounts. If a man takes a woman from a foreign land, the bride price shall be double. The woman herself is never mentioned as a participant in the negotiation, only as the object being transferred. The archaeological evidence shows this wasn't just law on paper, it was enforced practice. Excavations at Hittite sites across Anatolia have uncovered dozens of marriage contracts preserved on clay tablets. One, discovered at Kultepe, ancient Kanesh, and dated to around 1400 BCE, lists the bride price in meticulous detail. For the woman Taduhepa, daughter of Tushrata, 60 sheep, 30 measures of grain, 2 bronze axes, 1 silver ring weighing 5 shekels, clothing valued at 15 shekels of silver. The woman shall pass from the house of her father to the house of Supaluliyama when these goods are delivered. Taduhepa, that's her name, one of the few we know, but the document treats her as a commodity. The value of her life measured in sheep and grain, and the phrase shall pass is the same verb used elsewhere in Hittite texts, for transferring property, for moving livestock from one pen to another. What makes this particularly insidious is that the bride price wasn't just a one-time payment. It created a permanent debt relationship. If the woman failed to produce children, specifically male children, if she displeased her husband's family, if she became ill, her birth family remained responsible. The contract made her father's family guarantors of her value. If she wasn't satisfactory, they could be required to refund the bride price or provide a replacement daughter. A letter preserved in the Hittite diplomatic archive at Hattusa reveals the brutal reality. In the 14th century BCE, King Supaluliyuma I wrote to Pharaoh Akhenaten of Egypt. The letter was discovered in the Amarna archives. "You have sent me a woman who is lame in one foot. The bride price you received must be returned, or you must send another woman of equal value." The woman in question was an Egyptian princess, married off to forge a diplomatic alliance between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Even at the highest levels of society, women were subject to the same transactional logic. If defective, return for refund or exchange. But it gets darker when you look at the class system. Elite women commanded high bride prices, their value enhanced by their political connections and their presumed better upbringing. Poor women commanded prices as low as 1 sheep or a few measures of grain. The Hittite laws contain provisions for what happens if a man cannot afford a bride price. He can work for the woman's father for a specified number of years, essentially becoming an indentured servant. But the woman still had no say. She was the prize for which labor was exchanged. One Hittite tablet, currently housed in the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara, contains a legal case from around 1300 BCE. A man named Pahua complained that the woman he purchased as a wife refused to perform her household duties. The court's ruling: the woman's father had to either return the bride price or force the woman to comply. The woman herself was not called as a witness. Her resistance was irrelevant. The tablet ends with, "Thus the case is resolved. The woman shall obey or be returned." Returned, like damaged merchandise. A marriage built on wealth, not love. The bride was bought, and the groom, her purchaser, owned not just her labor and her body, but her entire existence. She became property with a documented price. But the Hittites weren't alone in commodifying marriage. Let's look at a much darker chapter in the history of dowries, one that had deadly consequences. In the Gupta Empire, marriage was a contract, and the bride was the price. Pataliputra, capital of the Gupta dynasty, 410 CE. A merchant family is in crisis. Their daughter, 17 years old, is of marriageable age, and they have found a suitable groom, a minor nobleman with good prospects. But there's a problem. He demands a dowry of 500 gold dinars, plus jewelry, textiles, and household goods valued at another 200 dinars. The merchant's entire fortune amounts to perhaps 300 dinars. If he refuses, his daughter becomes unmarriageable, a catastrophic loss of face in Gupta society. If he accepts, the family faces financial ruin. This was the dowry system of ancient India, and its effects were devastating. The practice had roots in earlier Vedic tradition, where gifts were given to the bride, Stridhan, as her personal property. But by the Gupta period, 320–550 CE, this had morphed into something far darker. Large payments from the bride's family to the groom's family that the bride herself would never control. The Manu Smriti, Laws of Manu, compiled around 200 BCE to 200 CE, documents this shift. While earlier verses described the Stridhan as the woman's property, later interpolations describe dowries as payments made to honor the groom's family. The text is explicit about the consequences of insufficient dowry. A woman who does not bring sufficient wealth to her husband's house may be rejected, divorced, or taken as a lesser wife. But the real horror emerges in court records and legal documents preserved in temple inscriptions and copperplate grants. A 5th century CE inscription from Iran in Madhya Pradesh describes a legal case. A woman named Devi was married with a dowry of 100 dinars. Within a year, her husband's family declared the dowry insufficient and demanded an additional 150 dinars. When her father couldn't pay, Devi was expelled from her husband's house. Not divorced, but cast out, leaving her in a legal limbo where she was still married, and thus couldn't remarry, but had no household, no support, no legal protection. The inscription records that Devi's father petitioned the local governor for justice. The ruling? The marriage was valid, the husband was within his rights to expel her for insufficient dowry, and the father was ordered to pay the additional amount or face seizure of his property. Devi's own wishes, her welfare, her future, irrelevant. Archaeological evidence from Gupta period sites shows the economic impact. Hoards of gold coins and jewelry, buried by families and never recovered, suggest families bankrupting themselves to pay dowries. One hoard discovered at Malhar in 2006 contained 189 gold coins and multiple pieces of jewelry buried around 450 CE. The coins were never claimed. The family apparently never survived to retrieve them. Contemporary sources reveal the violence this system enabled. The Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Faxian, traveling through India between 399–414 CE, noted in his travel diary, among the merchants and Vaishyas, if a daughter's dowry is deemed insufficient, she may be subjected to cruel treatment by her husband's family. Some are beaten regularly, some are starved. I have heard of cases where women were killed and new wives taken who brought greater wealth. Think about what that means. The dowry system created a financial incentive to abuse or kill wives. If a woman died and the husband remarried, he could collect a second dowry. The system effectively put a price on women's lives. A 5th century Sanskrit play, Abhijnanasa Kuntalam by Kalidasa, contains a revealing scene. A character remarks, "A daughter is a debt to be paid with gold when she reaches marriageable age." It's presented as conventional wisdom, not criticism. The audience was expected to nod along. Yes, daughters are debts, burdens to be discharged through payment. One of the most chilling documents is a private letter preserved on a palm leaf manuscript dated to around 480 CE, discovered in a cache of documents in Gujarat. A father writes to his brother, "I have 3 daughters. The eldest must soon be married, but I have not the wealth to provide a fitting dowry. I fear she will die unmarried, bringing shame to our line. Or worse, I will give her with insufficient dowry, and her husband's family will make her life a misery. I do not know which fate is worse, to die unwed or to die wed." The letter breaks off. We don't know what happened to his daughters, but we know the system that created this father's despair. We know it killed women. We know it ruined families. We know it continued for centuries. In a system built on transaction, the woman wasn't just the bride. She was the cost of a union, a debt to be paid, a burden to be transferred from one family to another. And if the payment was insufficient, she paid the price with her life. But dowries didn't just haunt ancient India. The same practice echoed through other cultures, where marriage was less about union and more about transaction. When the Mongols conquered, they didn't just take lands, they took women as spoils of war. Samarkand, 1220 CE. The siege is over. Genghis Khan's warriors have breached the walls of this jewel of the Silk Road, and now the city burns. In the central square, Mongol officers are organizing the survivors. The men of fighting age are being separated for execution. The craftsmen, the engineers, metal workers, and artisans are being tagged for deportation to Mongolia. And the women, thousands of them, ranging from young girls to middle-aged mothers, are being divided among the conquerors. This wasn't rape in the chaos of conquest, though that happened too. This was systematic, organized appropriation of human beings. These women were being distributed as wives. The Secret History of the Mongols, the primary source for early Mongol history, written sometime after Genghis Khan's death in 1227, is remarkably frank about this practice. It describes how conquered women were distributed according to rank. The highest-ranking women went to Genghis Khan himself or to his sons and brothers. Noble women of middling rank were awarded to high-ranking officers. Common women were divided among regular soldiers. The text describes it in the same tone it uses to describe the distribution of gold and horses. Section 255 says, "From the conquered city of Termez, Genghis Khan took 500 young women of good families to be distributed among his warriors as wives, that they might bear children and increase the Mongol people. Taken, distributed, that they might bear children." The women aren't actors in this sentence. They're resources to be allocated. Juzjani's Tabakat-i-Nasiri, a Persian history written in 1260, provides the perspective of the conquered. The historian Minhaj-i-Siraj Juzjani, writing about the Mongol conquests, records, "They took the daughters of nobles and princes, married them by their own rights, and compelled them to bear children. These women, torn from their families and wed to men who had slaughtered their fathers and brothers, were made to smile and serve, to bear sons for the empire that had destroyed their world." The archaeological and genetic evidence confirms the scale of this practice. A 2003 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics found that approximately 8% of men living in the former Mongol Empire territories share a Y chromosome signature that traces back to a single male ancestor living around 1,000 years ago, almost certainly Genghis Khan himself or one of his close male relatives. 16 million men today carry this genetic marker. Think about what that means. Genghis Khan and his immediate family impregnated so many women that 1 in 12 men in a region stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea carries their genetic signature. This isn't a testament to consent. It's evidence of systematic sexual appropriation on a staggering scale. But the truly dark part isn't just the numbers. It's what happened to these women after they were married. A Chinese source, Yuan Shi, The History of the Yuan Dynasty, compiled in 1370, describes the practice of kiemen, the taking of non-Mongol wives. These women were considered legally married, but they occupied an inferior status to Mongol-born wives. Their children were considered legitimate, but second class. One particularly haunting account comes from travels by William of Rubruck, a Franciscan missionary who visited the Mongol court in 1253-1255. He describes meeting a Hungarian woman named Maria who had been captured as a young girl during the Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1241. She had been forcibly married to a Mongol officer and had borne him 3 children. William writes, "She wept as she spoke to me in her native tongue, which she had not used in 12 years. She said she was married to her captor the same day her mother was killed. She said she prayed nightly that God would take her in her sleep, but he has not answered. She asked if I thought her children were damned, being born of violence. I could not answer her." Maria wasn't unusual. She was just one of thousands, tens of thousands of women absorbed into the Mongol Empire through conquest and forced marriage. The Mongol leadership saw this as strategy, not cruelty. By taking wives from conquered peoples, they created ties that bound those peoples to the empire. The children of these marriages served as living bridges between Mongol rulers and subject populations. It was deliberate policy recorded in the Jaws of Genghis Khan, the legal code, to bind the conquered peoples, take their women in marriage, that your sons may have their blood. In the aftermath of conquest, marriage was just another form of captivity. The ceremony might look like a wedding, the legal documents might use the language of matrimony, but strip away the veneer, and what remains? Systematic sexual slavery, genetic colonization, and the erasure of thousands of women who were given Mongol names, dressed in Mongol clothes, taught Mongol customs, and made to forget who they had been. This practice wasn't confined to the Mongols. In fact, similar customs were employed by other empires, including some that claimed to be more civilized. In Persia, marriage was a political weapon, a way for kings to consolidate their power across the empire. Persepolis, 480 BCE. Xerxes the First, king of kings, ruler of the Persian Empire, hosts a banquet in his newly completed palace. Among the guests are representatives from 23 satrapies, provinces stretching from Egypt to India. The evening's entertainment includes an unusual announcement. The king will take 5 new wives, one from each of 5 recently pacified territories. The women aren't present. They've already been selected by royal envoys and are en route to Persepolis. They haven't been asked. They've been informed. The Persian Empire perfected the practice of using marriage as a tool of imperial administration. The Achaemenid kings, Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, all maintained harems of hundreds or thousands of women, many of them daughters of conquered kings and nobles. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, describes this in his Histories. Book 3, section 84. The Persian king takes wives from all the nations he rules, that each people might feel bound to him by blood. These women are not chosen for love, but for the lands they represent. But Herodotus doesn't capture the full horror. For that, we have to look at the archaeological evidence and later sources. The Persepolis Fortification Archive, thousands of clay tablets discovered in 1933, contains administrative records from the reign of Darius the Boer, 522-486 BCE. Among the accounting records, grain rations, wine distributions, livestock inventories, are entries for the royal harem. Tablet PF 1841 lists 72 women receiving monthly rations at the palace. Their names are followed by ethnic identifiers: Istanu, the Lydian; Artabaza, the Cappadocian; Shapka, the Babylonian. These women came from across the empire. They were selected for their beauty and their political value, daughters or sisters of local rulers, living guarantees of their homeland's good behavior. If a province rebelled, everyone knew the king held their princess in his harem. The implicit threat was clear, but here's the darker detail that most historical accounts gloss over. These women rarely saw their families again. They lived in the Anderun, the inner palace, under guard. The classical writer Plutarch, in his Life of Artaxerxes, describes the harem as a beautiful prison. The women wore silk and jewels, lived in comfortable quarters, but they were prisoners nonetheless. Ctesias of Cnidus, a Greek physician who lived at the Persian court around 400 BCE, provides disturbing details in his Persica, preserved in fragments by later writers. He describes how women selected for the king's harem underwent preparation, a year-long process of perfuming, cosmetic treatments, and training in Persian customs and language. This wasn't done for their benefit. It was done to erase their original identities and transform them into acceptable Persian concubines. One fragment describes a woman named Amestris, daughter of a Lydian nobleman, who resisted this transformation. She refused to speak Persian, refused to adopt Persian dress, and attempted to escape twice. The second time, she was caught and, according to Ctesias, her feet were maimed to prevent further attempts. She remained in the harem for the rest of her life, unable to walk unassisted, a warning to other women who might resist. The genetic evidence confirms this wasn't just royal propaganda. Studies of modern populations in Iran and surrounding regions show evidence of significant genetic mixing during the Achaemenid period. Specifically, noble Y chromosome lineages, passed from fathers to sons, show extraordinary diversity across the empire, while mitochondrial DNA, passed from mothers to children, shows less diversity in elite populations. This pattern is consistent with a system where men from one ethnic group, Persian nobility, systematically took wives from multiple ethnic groups, but women did not move in the reverse direction. The Persepolis Oppadana reliefs, the massive stone carvings depicting tribute bearers from across the empire, include a haunting detail. Among the gifts presented to the Persian king are groups of women, identifiable by their distinct ethnic dress. An inscription accompanying one of these reliefs, partially damaged but reconstructed by scholars, reads, "The Bactrians bring lapis lazuli, gold, and their finest maidens to the King of Kings." Maidens, gifts, listed alongside stone and metal. The women from the harem rarely appear in historical records except as mothers of princes or occasionally as murder victims in palace intrigues. They lived in luxury, yes, but what kind of life is it when you're a political hostage in a golden cage, forcibly separated from your family and culture, made to serve a man you don't know in a place you never chose to go? In the palace, love was never a factor, only power, alliances, and submission. The king collected women the way he collected provinces, and with the same logic: more is better, diversity is strength, and loyalty is ensured through hostages. But it wasn't just royalty that used marriage as a power play. Let's take a look at the twisted world of child brides, where the victims were often too young to understand what was being done to them. In ancient Israel, marriage could begin before the bride ever reached puberty. Jerusalem, circa 950 BCE, during the reign of Solomon. In a modest house in the lower city, a father concludes negotiations with a merchant from a nearby village. They have agreed on a bride price of 20 shekels of silver. The merchant's son will marry the man's daughter. She is 11 years old. She's playing in the courtyard with a clay doll, unaware that her childhood has just been sold. Child marriage in ancient Israel wasn't an aberration. It was standard practice, especially among those who could arrange advantageous matches. The Hebrew Bible provides disturbing evidence of how young girls were married. Leviticus 27:5-7 sets monetary values for people of different ages in the context of temple vows. The text distinguishes between children from 5 years old to 20 years old, suggesting that 5 was considered the minimum age at which a child could be dedicated, or by extension, betrothed. But the truly revealing passages are in Exodus 21:7-11, which provides laws for a man who sells his daughter as a slave. The text specifies that if the master betroths her to himself or his son, she becomes a wife with certain protections. The age of the girl never mentioned, not a consideration. The Mishnah, the earliest major written collection of Jewish oral traditions, compiled around 200 CE, but preserving much earlier practices, is explicit. Tractate Sanhedrin 7.4 states, "A girl 3 years and 1 day old may be betrothed by intercourse." Read that again. 3 years old. The Mishnah is describing what was considered legally valid marriage. The Talmud, compiled between 200-500 CE, debates the age at which these marriages should be consummated, with some rabbis arguing for waiting until the girl reaches 12, considered the age of majority for females, while others defend much younger ages. These weren't theoretical debates, they were discussions of actual practice. Archaeological evidence from ancient Israel supports the textual sources. Analysis of skeletal remains from Iron Age sites, approximately 1586 BCE, shows that many women experienced their first pregnancy in their early to mid-teens, requiring that marriage happened even earlier, as there was typically a betrothal period. Some remains show signs of pregnancy-related death in girls as young as 14 or 15, their pelvises not fully developed, their bodies breaking under the strain of childbirth. The practice wasn't unique to Israelites. It was common throughout the ancient Near East. But what makes the Israelite case particularly well documented is the textual preservation. The Bible itself provides disturbing evidence. In Ezekiel 16:7-8, the prophet uses marriage metaphor to describe God's relationship with Jerusalem. "I made you flourish like a plant of the field. You grew up and developed and entered puberty. Your breasts had formed and your hair had grown, yet you were stark naked. I passed by you and saw you kicking about in your blood. And as you lay there in your blood, I said to you, 'Live.' When I passed by you again and looked upon you, behold, you were at the age for love." This passage describes sexual maturity, breast development, pubic hair, as unusual enough to warrant specific mention. The implication? Marriage often happened before these signs appeared. One of the most disturbing historical accounts comes from Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian. In Antiquities of the Jews, he describes the marriage customs of his ancestors. "It is our custom to marry girls as soon as they are physically able to bear children, which happens for most between the age of 12 and 13, though some marry younger. Some marry younger is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The rationale was economic and dynastic. Daughters were considered economic liabilities. They had to be fed and clothed, but could not inherit property or carry on the family name. Getting them married as early as possible reduced the burden on the family and secured alliances. The earlier, the better. But let's look at what this meant for the girls themselves. A 12-year-old girl married to a man in his 30s or 40s. Common age gaps in arranged marriages. No education beyond household tasks. No choice in partner. No understanding of what marriage would actually entail. And then pregnancy almost immediately, because producing heirs was the entire point. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the caves of Qumran and dated to between 200 BCE and 70 CE, include marriage contracts. One fragment describes a marriage between Miriam, daughter of Shimon, aged in her 11th year, and Johanan, son of Eleazar, aged in his 33rd year. 33 and 11. For these young girls, marriage wasn't a choice. It was an imposition. They went from playing with dolls to being wives and mothers, sometimes in the span of a year. Their bodies were claimed before they understood what bodies were for. Their futures decided by men who viewed them as assets to be traded, bloodlines to be continued, wombs to be filled. And before you think this was just ancient Israel being backwards, remember, this practice continued in various forms across many cultures for millennia. The reason we have so much documentation from ancient Israel is preservation, not uniqueness. This practice of forced early marriage was not unique to Israel. Other ancient cultures were no less brutal, and in some cases, they took the commodification of women to even more explicit extremes. In the heart of the Aztec Empire, marriage wasn't about love. It was about sacrifice. Tenochtitlan, 1487 CE. The dedication of the Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid, is nearly complete. The ceremony will require thousands of human sacrifices to appease the gods. But among those thousands will be a special group, 10 young women from noble families across the empire, selected to be married to the god Huitzilopochtli before their hearts are cut from their chests. The Aztec practice of sacrificial marriage is documented in multiple colonial-era codices written by both Spanish priests and indigenous informants shortly after the conquest. The Codex Magliabechiano, created around 1529 to 1553, contains a disturbing image. A woman dressed in elaborate bridal garments, adorned with flowers and quetzal feathers, being led up the steps of a pyramid. The accompanying text, written in Spanish, explains that she is married to the god in a ceremony before being sacrificed. But we have earlier, more detailed evidence from the Florentine Codex compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún between 1545-1590, based on interviews with elderly Aztecs who remembered pre-conquest practices. Book 2, Chapter 24 describes the festival of Oxpanistli, where a woman was chosen to impersonate the goddess Totsi. For 40 days, she was treated as a living goddess, given fine foods, beautiful clothes, attendants to serve her. She was married to a priest representing the god Tlaloc in an elaborate ceremony. And then, at the festival's climax, she was flayed alive, and a priest wore her skin. The Codex describes how these women were selected. They chose young women of good families, virgins who were beautiful and without blemish. These women knew they were chosen for marriage to the gods, which meant death, yet they were told this was the highest honor. Were they volunteers? The Spanish sources claim yes, but read the details more carefully. These women were selected as young girls, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, and raised in temple compounds for years, indoctrinated into believing their sacrifice was divinely ordained. By the time the ceremony arrived, resistance wasn't just pointless. It was unthinkable. Archaeological evidence from the Templo Mayor excavations, conducted since 1978, has uncovered the remains of numerous young women buried in ritual contexts. Osteological analysis shows many died violently, evidence of heart extraction, decapitation, or dismemberment. One burial, discovered in 1981, contained the remains of a woman approximately 18 to 20 years old, dressed in what appeared to be ceremonial attire, based on jade beads and gold ornaments found with the body. Her sternum showed the characteristic damage of heart extraction. But here's the part that makes this relevant to marriage customs. These weren't just sacrifices. They were ritualized as marriages. The Codex Borgia, a pre-Columbian manuscript that survived the Spanish destruction, shows scenes of women being ritually wed to priests or gods before sacrifice. The ceremonies included many elements of Aztec marriage rituals: the tying of the couple's garments together, the sharing of food, the exchange of gifts. The Aztecs didn't see a distinction between marriage and sacrifice in these contexts. Marriage to a god meant death. It was a marriage that could only be consummated in the afterlife. Diego Duran, a Dominican friar who wrote The History of the Indies of New Spain, 1581, based on now-lost Aztec codices, describes a specific case. In the year 1482, during the reign of Tizoc, a young woman named Miahuaxochitl was married to the god Tezcatlipoca. She lived as his bride for 1 year in the temple, treated with all honor. At the end of the year, at the festival of Toxcatl, She was taken to the top of the pyramid and sacrificed. Her family received great honors and gifts. They were told their daughter now lived in the paradise of the gods. The family's perspective is telling. They received compensation, essentially a bride price paid by the temple. Their daughter's death in divine marriage brought them social status and material rewards. The system incentivized families to offer their daughters for sacrifice. For the Aztecs, marriage wasn't just about unity. It was about appeasing the gods through bloodshed, about maintaining cosmic order through the sacrifice of young women dressed as brides. The fact that they ritualized these killings as marriages tells us something profound and disturbing about how marriage itself was conceived, as a transaction between families and gods, with women's lives as the currency. As brutal as the Aztecs were, their practices paled in comparison to what happened in some of the northern warrior cultures, where marriage wasn't just political, it was violent proof of dominance. In Viking lands, marriage could be a trial by fire or by battle. The fjord is icy, the wind cutting. Norway, circa 935 CE. In a clearing surrounded by pine trees, two men face each other, swords drawn. They're fighting over a woman, the daughter of a local jarl. But this isn't spontaneous violence or romantic rivalry. This is holmgang, a legally sanctioned duel to determine who will marry her. The woman stands to the side, watching two men try to kill each other for the right to own her. The practice of trial marriage or trial by combat for marriage rights was documented in multiple Scandinavian sources. The Egil saga, one of the most famous Icelandic sagas written in the 13th century, but describing events from the 10th century, contains several examples. Chapter 47 describes how Egil Skallagrimsson's brother, Thorolf, won his wife Asgerd through holmgang. A rival suitor challenged Thorolf's right to marry her. They fought on a small island, Holmor in Old Norse, hence holmgang, going to the island. The rules were strict. A cloak would be laid on the ground, and the fighters could not step outside it. First blood usually won, but fights could be to the death. Thorolf won. Asgerd had no say in any of this. She was the prize for which men fought. But the sagas, while partially literary inventions, are based on actual legal customs preserved in law codes. The Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code, contains provisions for holmgang and marriage disputes. Section 134 states, if two men both claim betrothal to a woman, and the woman's father cannot decide between them, they may settle the matter by holmgang. The woman's own preference, not mentioned. The system had a twisted logic. Physical strength was valued in Viking society. The man who won the duel was presumably the better warrior, therefore the better provider and protector, therefore the better husband. But this logic only works if you view marriage exclusively through the lens of male competition and female passivity. The archaeological evidence for this practice is indirect but suggestive. Viking Age burial sites sometimes contain pairs of male bodies, showing evidence of simultaneous violent death, possibly holmgang participants who killed each other. One such double burial, excavated at Repton in Derbyshire, England, a Viking camp, shows two men, both with fatal sword wounds, buried with honor. Accompanying runic inscriptions suggest they died in a marriage dispute. But holmgang wasn't the only trial associated with Viking marriage. Some sagas describe bride captures where the groom had to physically seize and carry away his bride as proof of his strength. Laxdæla Saga, chapter 20, describes how Kjartan Olafsson took Hrefna as his wife by lifting her and carrying her across a river while she struggled and screamed. The saga presents this as romantic, proof of his strength and determination. Read it again. It's a description of kidnapping. The Jomsvikinga saga includes an even more disturbing practice. Among the Jomsvikings, a legendary brotherhood of Viking warriors, marriage could only happen if the warrior successfully raided an enemy and brought back a woman as proof of his prowess. The saga describes this as winning a wife through valor, but the mechanism is clear: abduction. One particularly chilling runestone, the Orkesta runestone in Sweden, catalogued as U344, includes an inscription that translates roughly as, Ulfkel and Arnkel raised this stone in memory of their father, Rodolf, who went east and won a wife with his sword and brought her home to bear his sons. Won a wife with his sword, not courted, not married through negotiation, but won, through violence. In some parts of Scandinavia, the trial wasn't physical combat, but an endurance test. The groom would have to perform some feat of strength or survival, rowing a boat for a day without rest, carrying a boulder a certain distance, surviving a night in the wilderness. These trials served the same function as holmgang, proving masculinity through physical prowess, with the woman as the reward. For the women involved, these customs meant their marriages were determined by male violence and male endurance. Their role was to be claimed, seized, won. They were trophies proving the strength of the men who took them. In Viking culture, marriage wasn't about courtship. It was a bloody contest for survival, for dominance, for the right to claim a woman as property. And the culture celebrated this. The sagas present these stories as heroic, as proof of Viking manhood. But strip away the romanticism, and what remains? Systematic violence against women, codified in law and glorified in literature. But the brutality didn't stop with contests. Some marriages were even more sinister in their design, marriages that existed purely to demonstrate power over defeated enemies. In the kingdom of Kush, marriage wasn't an act of unity, it was a tool of conquest. Meroe, kingdom of Kush, modern Sudan, 690 BCA. King Taharqa has just returned from a military campaign in Lower Egypt. Among his entourage are 12 women, wives and daughters of defeated Egyptian nobles. They're being led through the streets of the capital, dressed in Kushite garments, jewelry marking them as members of the royal household. They are now the king's wives. They had no choice in the matter. Their families were either dead or powerless. This was conquest made flesh. The practice of taking the wives of defeated enemies was standard procedure in the kingdom of Kush, documented in both Egyptian and Kushite sources. The Kushites, who ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty, circa 760 to 656 BCE, left extensive records carved in stone. The victory stela of King Paye, formerly read as Pianki, erected around 727 BCE and now in the Cairo Museum, describes his conquest of Egypt. After listing the cities captured and enemies defeated, the text states, "His Majesty took the wives of the rebel kings into his household, that the blood of the conquered might serve the victor." That phrase, "that the blood of the conquered might serve the victor," reveals the logic. Taking the wives of defeated enemies served multiple purposes. It humiliated the defeated men, it prevented them from producing heirs who might seek revenge, and it allowed the conqueror to father children on these women, creating a generation with mixed loyalties. But the Kushite practice went further. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, Book 2, section 29 to 30, describes Kushite customs, noting, "When the Kushite kings conquer their neighbors, they take the queens and princesses as wives. These women, even of royal blood, become the lowest-ranking wives in the Kushite household, serving the Kushite queen and bearing children who will never inherit." This was strategic humiliation. An Egyptian princess, accustomed to reverence and power, reduced to the status of a junior wife in the household of her people's conqueror. Her children would be Kushite, raised as Kushites, taught to view Egypt as the enemy. The destruction wasn't just political, it was generational. Archaeological evidence from Kushite tombs supports these textual accounts. The tomb of King Taharqa at Nuri, excavated in 1917 by George Reisner, contained the remains of multiple women. Osteological analysis conducted in the 1990s, using modern techniques, revealed that, while Taharqa himself showed skeletal morphology consistent with Nubian populations, several of the women showed morphology more typical of Egyptian populations. DNA analysis was limited by degradation, but the physical evidence suggests these women came from outside the Kushite kingdom. More telling are the burial inscriptions. Some of these women were buried with their names, but without titles. In Kushite royal tombs, Kushite queens and mothers of kings were buried with elaborate titles: king's wife, king's mother, mistress of Kush. These foreign women had only their names: Shepenwepet, Nitocris, Amenerdis, Egyptian names, but no titles. They were wives in biology, but not in status. One inscription, from the tomb of Queen Kalhada, wife of King Senkamaniskin, circa 640-620 BCE, lists the women of the royal household. It includes 14 women of Egypt taken in war, given to the king as wives. 14 women reduced to a single line in an inventory. The practice continued for centuries. Even after the Cushites were expelled from Egypt, they continued to take wives from conquered peoples. A stela from the reign of King Espelta, circa 600–580 BCE, describes a campaign against a people called the Regresa. The victory inscription states, "His Majesty took 22 women of the Regresa, the daughters of their chiefs, and made them wives, that they might forget their people and serve Cush." That they might forget their people. That's the goal stated explicitly. Use marriage to erase identity, to convert the daughters of enemies into mothers of Cushites, to weaponize reproduction itself. For these women, marriage wasn't a blessing. It was a prison sentence imposed by the might of Cushite power, enforced by the reality that they could never return home, that their families were dead or subjugated. That resistance would achieve nothing but their own deaths. The Cushite system was honest in its brutality. They didn't pretend these marriages were voluntary or romantic. They were documented acts of conquest, written into stone stelae for all to see. The message was clear. Defeat didn't end on the battlefield. It continued in the bedchamber, generation after generation. And it wasn't just the women of conquered territories who suffered in these forced unions. There were darker practices involving human lives that went even further into the territory of the unthinkable. In the Maya civilization, marriage wasn't about union. It was about control, and sometimes brutal submission, Palenque, 711 CE. The city-state has just concluded a war with rival Tonina. The terms of peace include the usual tribute, jade, cacao, quetzal feathers, and something else. 5 noblewomen from Palenque's royal families will marry into Tonina's royal house. The women are assembled in the palace courtyard. They're dressed in their finest garments, jeweled and painted. But their faces tell a different story. These aren't brides. These are hostages. Maya marriage, particularly among the elite, was fundamentally about political alliance and dynastic power. The hieroglyphic texts carved on stelae, temple walls, and pottery across the Maya world document this practice extensively. At Yaxchilan, the famous lintels carved during the reign of Shield Jaguar, 6–81–742 CE, include detailed texts describing royal marriages. Lintel 23 depicts Lady Kaeb al-Zouk, wife of Shield Jaguar, performing a bloodletting ritual. The accompanying text describes how she was given to Shield Jaguar by the king of Calakmul, a political arrangement cementing an alliance. The verb used is tzak, to present, to offer up. The same verb used elsewhere in Maya texts for presenting captives for sacrifice. The epigrapher David Stewart's translation of texts from Dos Pilas reveals even more disturbing details. In 735 CE, after a successful military campaign, the Dos Pilas king received 3 women from the defeated city of Ceibal. The text states they were bound to Dos Pilas nobles. The word kak, bound, is the same term used for captives bound with rope. These women weren't just politically married, they were literally prisoners. But the Maya practice extended beyond intercity politics. Marriage within Maya society reinforced strict hierarchical control. The Popol Vuh, the Maya creation text, written down in the 16th century, but preserving much older traditions, includes passages describing how the gods created women to serve men, to bear their children, to maintain their households. This wasn't descriptive, it was prescriptive. Marriage was service. Archaeological excavation of Maya residential compounds shows the physical reality. Elite compounds included a main palace where the male head of household lived, surrounded by smaller structures housing wives, concubines, and children. Isotopic analysis of remains from these compounds, conducting studies measuring diet and origin through bone chemistry, reveals that many of the women came from distant regions, while the men were local. The women were imports, brought in through marriage alliances. One particularly telling site is the royal tomb at Calakmul, excavated in 1997. The tomb contained a male skeleton, identified through osteological analysis as approximately 45–50 years old at death, showing evidence of a high-protein diet and minimal physical labor, consistent with royal status. Buried in an antechamber were 3 female skeletons, all younger, ages 20 to 30, showing signs of much harder physical lives despite also being elite, based on burial goods. Their teeth showed different isotopic signatures from different regions of the Maya world. These women had been brought to Calakmul from elsewhere, married into the royal house, and buried as secondary figures even in death. The Spanish priest Diego de Landa, writing in the 1560s after observing Maya practices in Yucatan, noted, "The Maya nobles take many wives and treat them as property. If a wife displeases, she may be cast out or given to another man. The women have no say in this. I have seen women pass between men like currency, with no more thought than one gives to trading a pot." But perhaps the darkest aspect of Maya marriage customs was the practice of substitute wives. When a nobleman died, Maya custom, documented in colonial-era legal proceedings recorded in Spanish archives, sometimes required his widow to marry his brother or closest male relative. This practice, called levirate marriage in anthropological terms, existed to keep property within the family line. The widow's consent was irrelevant. She was property of the family, not of the individual man she'd married. A colonial-era legal document from 1577, preserved in the archives of the Indies in Seville, describes a case from Yucatan. The woman Ixcan was widow of the nobleman Apuch. His brother Atzul claimed her as wife by Maya custom. Ixcan fled to the Spanish authorities, claiming she had been beaten and forced. The alcalde ruled that under Spanish law she could refuse, but the Maya nobles protested that this violated their ancient customs and would destabilize marriages throughout the region. The document doesn't record what happened to Ixcan, but it reveals the system. Women inherited like property, passed from brother to brother, their wishes irrelevant to the social order. In the world of the Maya, marriage was a weapon, and the women were the ammunition, fired from one city-state to another, used to cement alliances or demonstrate conquest. Their lives bound by decisions made by men they often never met until their wedding day, if they were lucky enough to meet them even then. But the Maya were not alone in using marriage as a tool of power and control. Other civilizations followed a darker path still. In Assyria, marriage didn't always mean a joining of hearts. It often meant a conquest of souls. Nineveh, 700 BCE. The Assyrian king Sennacherib has just concluded a campaign against the kingdom of Judah. The siege of Lachish has ended in total victory. Among the spoils being cataloged in the palace courtyard are 46 cities worth of tribute, thousands of prisoners, and 33 women from noble families. These women are being distributed to Assyrian generals and nobles as wives, rewards for military service, tools of political control, and living symbols of Assyria's dominance. The Assyrians were perhaps the most brutally honest ancient civilization about using marriage as an instrument of imperial power. Their palace reliefs and royal inscriptions document the practice with shocking clarity. The Taylor prism, a hexagonal clay prism inscribed with the annals of Sennacherib, now in the British Museum, describes the 701 BCE campaign against Judah. I besieged 46 of his strong cities. I drove out 250 people, young and old, male and female. The daughters of the king of Judah and the daughters of his nobles I took for wives for my officials and commanders. I took for wives. Not arranged marriages, not diplomatic unions. Took. The palace reliefs at Nineveh, now partially preserved in the British Museum and the Louvre, show the aftermath of conquest. One series of panels depicts the siege and fall of Lachish. Among the images, columns of captives, separated by gender. The men are shown being executed or led away in chains. The women are shown being presented to Assyrian officials. Archaeological inscriptions accompanying these reliefs describe the women as distributed to the households of the king's servants. But the fullest documentation comes from the Assyrian legal codes, preserved on cuneiform tablets. Middle Assyrian Law 34, circa 1075 BCE, states, "If a man takes a woman in war, she becomes his wife if he brings her into his house and provides for her. Her consent is not required." The law is explicit. Forced marriage of captives is legal and binding. Law 35 continues, "If a man takes a woman in war and she has a husband still living, she remains married to her captor. Her previous marriage is dissolved. The woman's existing marriage, her existing life, simply ceased to exist in Assyrian law once she was captured." What did this mean in practice? Archaeological evidence from Assyrian sites provides disturbing details. Excavations at Kalhu, ancient Nimrud, uncovered private archives from the households of Assyrian officials. One tablet, catalogued as ND 2307 and dated to around 710 BCE, is a household inventory. Among the property listed, 4 women from the land of Musasir, taken in the campaign of the 15th year, given to this household by the king's decree. 2 have borne children. 1 attempted escape and was punished. 1 died in childbirth. That's the entire entry. 4 human lives reduced to an inventory. Notation: their origins noted only to document they were legally acquired war spoils. Another tablet from the same archive, ND 2311, is even more chilling. It's a letter from one Assyrian official to another. I have received the 2 Elamite women you sent. 1 is satisfactory and has been placed in my household. The other is defective. She has a limp and missing teeth. I request you send a replacement or credit the value against future tribute. A human being described as defective and requested to be replaced like faulty merchandise. The Assyrian system didn't just take women as war brides, it industrialized the practice. The vast Assyrian bureaucracy kept meticulous records of captured women, tracking their distribution, their offspring, their status. Some women were kept in palace harems. Others were distributed to military officers as rewards. Still others were granted to temples as servants or sacred prostitutes. For the women themselves, this system meant total erasure. A 7th century BCE inscription from the reign of Ashurbanipal describes how captured women were, given Assyrian names, dressed in Assyrian garments, and taught Assyrian speech, that they might forget their origins and serve their new masters without divided loyalty. The goal wasn't just political, it was psychological. Transform the captive into a wife, the enemy into a mother of Assyrian children. Erase her past so completely that resistance becomes not just impossible, but unthinkable. One rare first-person account survives, though filtered through Assyrian propaganda. An inscription from Nineveh quotes a captured woman, her original name not preserved, given the Assyrian name Nakia, as saying, "I was a daughter of kings, now I am a servant. I bore children to a man whose language I did not speak, whose gods I did not worship. I have forgotten my mother's face. This is the will of Ashur." The final phrase, "This is the will of Ashur," was likely added by the Assyrian scribe. But the rest? Those details about language, gods, forgotten faces, those feel too specific, too painful to be pure propaganda. Someone lived that experience, probably thousands of someones. For these women, marriage wasn't a blessing. It was a prison sentence imposed by the might of Assyrian power and enforced by a vast imperial system that treated human beings as interchangeable administrative units. But Egypt wasn't alone in its pursuit of power through blood. Other cultures had their own ways of intertwining family and politics, often with even more devastating consequences. In the land of the Sumerians, marriage was an act of divine manipulation, and the groom was often a god. Uruk, circa 2400 BCE. In the Eanna temple complex dedicated to the goddess Inanna, a ritual is about to begin. The Ensi, city ruler Lugal Kisalsi, is preparing for the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage. But his bride isn't a woman of flesh and blood. His bride is the goddess herself, represented by the high priestess. This isn't symbolic. After the ceremony, they will consummate the marriage in the temple's inner sanctum. The priestess has no choice. This is her sacred duty. This is her life. The Sumerian practice of sacred marriage is extensively documented in cuneiform tablets, temple hymns, and archaeological evidence. But the reality behind the ritual was far darker than the religious texts suggest. The clearest documentation comes from temple hymns, particularly those dedicated to Inanna. The hymn to Inanna and Dumuzi, preserved on tablets from the early dynastic period, circa 2500 BCE, describes the sacred marriage in explicit detail. It's presented as a joyous union between the goddess and her consort, Dumuzi, symbolized through the ruler and the priestess, but read carefully between the lines. Other texts reveal that the priestesses selected for this role, called Lukur or Naditu, were chosen as young girls and raised within the temple complex. They were forbidden to marry ordinary men, forbidden to bear children outside the ritual context, forbidden to leave the temple without permission. They lived their entire lives in service to these sacred marriages. The laws of Ur-Nammu, dating to circa 2100 BCE, the oldest surviving law code, includes provisions for these temple women. Law 5 states, if a Lukor priest woman leaves the temple to marry, she shall be drowned. Law 6, if a Lukor woman bears a child outside the sacred rites, she and the child shall be put to death. These weren't women choosing a spiritual path. They were trapped in a system that gave them two choices: serve as ritual brides in the sacred marriage ceremonies, or die. Archaeological excavations at Ur uncovered the cemetery of the temple priestesses. Leonard Woolley's 1920s excavations revealed a separate burial ground for Lukor women, distinct from the royal cemetery and from the commoner graveyards. Osteological analysis of these remains, conducted in the 2000s using modern forensic techniques, revealed disturbing patterns. Many of the women died young, between ages 16 and 30. Several showed evidence of obstetric injuries, suggesting difficult childbirths. Despite religious texts claiming these women were forbidden to bear children, the physical evidence showed otherwise. They were becoming pregnant, presumably during the sacred marriage rituals, and dying in childbirth without adequate medical care. One particular burial, designated PG 1237, contained a woman approximately 18-22 years old. She was buried with elaborate jewelry marking her as a high-status priestess, including a headdress of gold leaves and lapis lazuli. But her skeleton told a different story. Her pelvis showed evidence of a partially healed fracture, likely from a difficult childbirth. She'd survived one pregnancy that nearly killed her. The final pregnancy did. The cuneiform texts from temple archives reveal the administrative reality. One tablet from the Temple of Inanna at Nippur, circa 2300 BCE, catalogued as CBS 8383, lists 14 Lukor women by name, along with the rulers they were married to in ceremonies. The tablet notes that 3 died during the year, and replacements needed to be selected from among the daughters of noble families. Replacements. They're listing human beings like replaceable inventory. But perhaps the most chilling document is a personal letter preserved on a small clay tablet from around 2200 BCE, currently in the Yale Babylonian collection. It's from a father to his daughter, who has been selected as a temple priestess. My daughter, I know you weep. I know you do not wish this path. But the temple has chosen you, and we cannot refuse. To refuse is death for our entire family. You will serve the goddess. You will participate in the sacred marriages. This is our duty to the gods. Remember that I love you, even as I give you to them. For the women of Sumer, these sacred marriages weren't divine. They were a form of control, one that erased their will for the sake of maintaining the political and religious power structure. The rituals clothed in religious language what was essentially systematic sexual exploitation of young women who had no legal right to refuse. These forced unions weren't just reserved for royalty or priests. Common people had their own forms of twisted marriage traditions. In the wilds of ancient Britain, a woman's marriage could begin with a struggle, and sometimes a fight for survival. The hill fort stands dark against the autumn sky. Britain, circa 300 BCE. A raiding party from a neighboring tribe has surrounded a small settlement. They're not here for food or weapons. They're here for brides. This is the season of bride capture, a Celtic tradition where young men prove their manhood by abducting women from rival tribes. The women fight, scream, resist. It doesn't matter. By tomorrow, they'll be wives. The Celtic practice of marriage by capture is documented by Roman authors who encountered these tribes during conquest. Julius Caesar, in his Commentarie de Bello Gallico, written 5849 BCE, describes Celtic marriage customs. The Britons practice a form of marriage by capture, where men seize women from neighboring tribes. This is not considered theft or rape by their laws, but a legitimate form of marriage if the woman is brought into the man's household and provided for. But the most detailed account comes from Strabo, the Greek geographer writing in the 1st century CE. In Geography, Book 4, he describes the Celts of Gaul. Their young men establish manhood through raids. They take livestock, weapons, and women. A man is not considered eligible for marriage until he has successfully captured a woman from an enemy tribe. The woman taken becomes his wife, regardless of her wishes. Diodorus Siculus, another first-century writer, adds disturbing detail. The women taken in these captures often resist violently. They are beaten into submission. Once they bear a child to their captor, they are considered bound to him by Celtic law and cannot leave. The archaeological evidence supports these textual accounts. Celtic hill forts show signs of specialized bride raids. Archaeological contexts where young women's jewelry and personal items are found mixed with weapons and evidence of violence, suggesting struggles during abduction attempts. Excavations at Maiden Castle in Dorset revealed a mass grave from the pre-Roman Iron Age containing the remains of women, showing trauma patterns consistent with violent capture. Broken bones, particularly defensive fractures of the arms and hands, healed at awkward angles, suggesting they weren't properly set. These women had been injured in struggles and survived, living with permanent disability. DNA analysis of Iron Age Celtic populations in Britain reveals patterns consistent with male-mediated gene flow between regions. Specifically, while male lineages, Y chromosome, show strong regional clustering, female lineages, mitochondrial DNA, show much more mixing. The most likely explanation: women being forcibly moved between tribal territories through capture and marriage. Celtic mythology preserves echoes of this practice. The Irish saga Tyne Bo Cuailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, though written down in the 12th century CE, preserves much older oral traditions. It includes multiple stories of women being taken in raids. Queen Medb's own origin story involves being captured by King Conchobar, who made her his wife. The saga presents this as normal, even glorious. But folklore also preserves the women's perspective, usually in fragmentary form. An old Irish lament, preserved in the Book of Leinster, 12th century but containing much older material, includes these lines: "I was taken from my mother's house across the dark water to a man whose tongue I did not know, whose gods were not my gods. I bore his children, but I am not his wife, I am his captive." The lament is attributed to a woman of the Araean taken by the Ulaid, a woman from one Irish tribe captured by another. Roman legal records from conquered Celtic territories provide even more disturbing documentation. After Britain became a Roman province, 43 CE, Roman magistrates had to adjudicate disputes involving Celtic marriage customs. One legal case, preserved in a fragmentary inscription found at Caerleon and dated to around 80 CE, describes a woman who escaped from her Celtic husband and sought Roman protection, claiming she had been captured and forced into marriage. The Roman magistrate ruled in her favor, stating that under Roman law, marriage required consent. The Celtic tribal leaders protested, arguing this would invalidate hundreds of marriages and destabilize their society. The inscription doesn't record the final resolution, but the fact that such cases existed, that women were fleeing these marriages when they had any opportunity, tells us everything we need to know about how voluntary these unions were. Some Celtic tribes ritualized the practice into their formal marriage ceremonies. Even in arranged marriages between families, the groom was expected to capture the bride in a ceremonial reenactment. The woman would flee, often not far and not seriously. The groom would chase her, catch her, and carry her over the threshold of his dwelling. This ritual persisted in various forms through medieval Europe and echoes even into modern wedding traditions, the groom carrying the bride over the threshold. But understanding where these charming traditions came from actual violent abduction, makes them considerably less charming. The Brehon laws, the ancient Irish legal code compiled in the 7th, 8th centuries CE, but preserving much older Celtic legal traditions, actually codifies different types of marriage. Type 9 is lanamnus foxale, marriage by abduction. It's listed alongside voluntary marriages, arranged marriages, and temporary marriages. Abduction was literally a legal category of marriage, requiring the abductor to pay compensation to the woman's family after the fact, but recognizing the union as valid. The compensation wasn't for the woman's trauma or violation. It was for the theft of property, the woman, from her family. The bride capture wasn't a romantic gesture. It was an act of dominance, and for the woman, a loss of everything: her family, her home, her autonomy, her future. She became property of a man who had proven his worth by successfully stealing her. But While the Celts had their violent customs, the power of marriage in ancient cultures wasn't always so direct. Sometimes it involved deeper, darker spiritual practices. In Ireland, some marriages didn't happen through love, they happened through a sale. A crossroads in Connaught, Ireland, 520 CE, market day. Among the goods being sold, cattle, wool, bronze tools, a transaction of a different sort is taking place. A nobleman has fallen on hard times. His debts are considerable. His solution? He's brought his wife to market. Yes, his wife. She stands beside him, a rope around her neck like livestock being sold, as he negotiates with potential buyers. This isn't metaphor. This is same winter, wife sale, and it's perfectly legal under Brehon law. The practice of wife sale in ancient Ireland is documented in multiple legal texts, and it's one of the more disturbing aspects of Celtic marriage law. The Creath Gablach, a legal text from the 8th century CE that codifies much older practices, describes the conditions under which a man could sell his wife. According to the text, if a man fell into debt or needed to raise capital for specific legal purposes, such as paying compensation for a crime or ransoming a family member, he could sell his wife to another man. The wife became the legal property of the purchaser, who gained all marital rights over her. The original husband was freed from any obligation to her, the woman's consent. The law doesn't mention it even once, but wife sale wasn't just about debt. The Cain Lanamna, Law of Couples, another Brehon law text, describes how wives could be traded between men to settle disputes, seal alliances, or exchange favors. One passage states, if two men of equal rank wish to settle a grievance without bloodshed, they may exchange wives. Each man receives the other's wife, and the dispute is considered settled. Think about that. Women traded between men like playing pieces in a game of diplomacy. Archaeological evidence for this practice is scarce. You can't excavate a transaction. But we have documentary evidence from early Christian-era Irish sources that describe the practice with horror. St. Patrick's Confessio, written in the 5th century CE, includes a passage condemning the practice. They sell their wives as one sells cattle, and think no sin of it. The women weep and plead, but their tears are as nothing to these men, who value gold above the sanctity of marriage. Later Irish annals record specific instances. The Annals of Ulster, entry for 771 CE, records, a great shame in Ulayed this year, when Flaithbertach, son of Loingsec, sold his wife More to Wengus of Ailech for 3 milk cows and 20 measures of grain. More fled to the monastery at Kildare seeking sanctuary. The entry is brief, but it tells us several things. First, the practice was common enough to be recorded in annals focused primarily on battles and deaths of kings. Second, the price, 3 cows and 20 measures of grain, is about what you'd pay for a decent horse. Third, the woman fled, seeking sanctuary in a Christian monastery, one of the few places where Irish law didn't fully apply. Did she get sanctuary? The annals don't say. They move on to the next entry, a dispute over cattle in Munster. The practice continued well into the Christian period, despite church opposition. A 9th century Irish penitential, a handbook for priests hearing confessions, includes this entry. If a man sells his wife, he shall do penance for 7 years. If he sells her into slavery, he shall do penance for 14 years. If he sells her and she dies as a result, he shall do penance for life and make pilgrimage to Rome. Note the hierarchy of sin. Selling your wife, 7 years penance. Selling her into slavery, 14 years. Her actual death, a lifetime of penance. The church was more concerned with the degree of harm than with the fundamental violation of treating a woman as property. But the most chilling evidence comes from legal case records preserved in monastic manuscripts. One case, recorded in the Book of Ballymote, 14th century but containing much older material, describes a dispute from the 10th century. Domhnall, son of Niall, brought suit against Cathal, son of Fergus, claiming that the wife he purchased from Cathal was barren and demanding return of the purchase price. Cathal argued that the woman was fertile when sold and that Domhnall's inability to produce children was his own failing. The Brehon judge ruled that Cathal must take the woman back and return the purchase price, less compensation for the years Domhnall had use of her. Use of her. The legal term is usaid, Usage, like the use of a tool or a draft animal. The woman in this case, her name is actually preserved, Gormle, is never mentioned as a party to the case. She's the disputed property, not a participant in the legal proceeding. The ruling determines she must return to her original owner, Cathal, who presumably could sell her again to someone else. In the marketplace of ancient Ireland, love wasn't the currency, power and property were. Women were goods to be traded, sold, and returned if defective. The practice treated them as having no more inherent worth than livestock, no more rights than a bronze cauldron or a wool cloak. But the practice of using women as political and economic tools didn't stop in the Celtic world. Other empires had their own twisted systems, and some took the concept of bloodline purity to its ultimate horrifying conclusion. In Egypt, royal marriages weren't just about preserving bloodlines. They were about creating divine rulers, at any cost. The Valley of the Kings, 1323 BCE. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, archaeologists would later discover something that confirmed what ancient texts had long suggested: mummified fetuses, 2 of them, buried alongside the young pharaoh. DNA analysis conducted in 2010 would reveal that these were his daughters, stillborn or dying shortly after birth. Their mother was Tutankhamun's half-sister and wife, Ankhesenamun. The baby's DNA showed catastrophic levels of inbreeding, genetic defects so severe they could never have survived. This was the price of keeping the bloodline pure. The practice of royal incest in Egypt wasn't occasional or aberrant. It was systematic, mandatory, and lasted for over 3,000 years. From the earliest dynasties through the Ptolemaic period, Egypt's rulers married their sisters, half-sisters, and sometimes their own daughters to maintain what they believed was the divine purity of the royal blood. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. The tomb of Amenhotep II, 1427-1400 BCE, contains an inscription describing his marriage to his sister, Tia'a. The text reads, "The king's great wife, his beloved, lady of the 2 lands, Tia'a, born of the king's mother and the king's father, sister in blood to his majesty, united with him in sacred marriage that the divine line might remain pure." Sister in blood leaves no room for ambiguity. But the most extensively documented case is the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt from 323 BCE to 30 BCE. The Ptolemies weren't ethnically Egyptian, but they adopted Egyptian royal customs with zealous enthusiasm, including sibling marriage. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus married his full sister Arsenos, around 273 BCE. This shocked Greek contemporaries, who found the practice abhorrent, but the Ptolemies defended it as necessary to maintain their claim to the Egyptian throne. They issued coins showing the divine couple together, commissioned inscriptions praising their sacred union, and established a religious cult around their marriage. But look at the genealogy. Cleopatra VII. Yes, that Cleopatra was the product of at least 5 generations of sibling marriage. Her family tree is barely a tree at all. It's almost a straight line. Recent genetic modeling based on historical genealogies suggests that Cleopatra had roughly the same level of genetic diversity as a child born to a parent-child incestuous relationship. Her ancestors kept marrying each other, generation after generation, doubling back on the same genetic material again and again. The physical consequences were severe. Medical papyri from Ptolemaic Egypt describe royal health problems that strongly suggest genetic disorders: epilepsy, fertility problems, shortened lifespans, physical deformities. One papyrus from the Ptolemaic period, housed in the Brooklyn Museum, describes treating a royal patient, name damaged, but context suggests Ptolemy VIII, for seizures, joint pain, and what might have been a genetic metabolic disorder. Ptolemy VIII, incidentally, married his sister, Cleopatra II. When she objected to him taking a second wife, their own daughter, Cleopatra III, he married the daughter anyway. He was simultaneously married to a woman and her daughter, who was also his daughter. The genetic implications are nightmare fuel, but the human cost extends beyond physical health. In the Cairo Museum sits a damaged papyrus from around 150 BCE, a private letter from a Ptolemaic princess, name not preserved, to someone she addresses as dear friend. The legible portions say, my brother whom I must call husband. I know it is the will of the gods, but I cannot. The children are weak, 2 have already died. I dream of running, of being someone else, somewhere else. But there is nowhere to run when you are born to the purple. The letter breaks off. Damaged, fragmentary, but the voice of a woman trapped in a system that valued bloodline over health, divine right over human suffering. The practice wasn't limited to the Ptolemies. Earlier dynasties show similar patterns. Genetic analysis of New Kingdom royal mummies reveals high levels of homozygosity, genetic uniformity, indicating repeated inbreeding. The mummy of Hatshepsut, 1479 to 1458 BCE, shows evidence of diabetes and bone disease, both potentially linked to inbreeding. Her father, Thutmose I, had married his sister. Hatshepsut herself married her half-brother, Thutmose II. One of the most heartbreaking pieces of evidence comes from tomb KV35 in the Valley of the Kings, excavated in 1907. The mummy inside, possibly Akhenaten or a close relative, shows severe genetic abnormalities: elongated skull, feminine hip structure, possible Marfan syndrome, or another genetic disorder. For decades, scholars debated whether these features were artistic stylization or actual physical traits. DNA analysis in 2010 confirmed these were real genetic abnormalities, consistent with generations of inbreeding. The tomb also contained the mummies of 2 fetuses, stillborn or dying shortly after birth. Their DNA showed they were products of a union between siblings or possibly between parent and child. They never had a chance. What Egypt called sacred was nothing but an incestuous web of power, twisted in the name of divinity. The divine right of kings, made literal through keeping divine blood pure, created generations of sickness, suffering, and stillborn children who died for a concept. And the Egyptians weren't even the most extreme. One final civilization took the practice of marriage as power to its ultimate conclusion: ritual sacrifice. In the Inca Empire, marriage wasn't just about ceremony, it was about sacrifice, both of body and soul. Mount Lulailico, on the border between Argentina and Chile, elevation 22,100 feet. In 1999, archaeologists discovered 3 child mummies, perfectly preserved by the cold, dry air. The oldest was a girl of about 15. She was dressed in the finest textiles, wearing a silver pin marking her as Akala, a chosen woman of the Inca elite. Analysis of her hair revealed she'd been fattened on special foods for a year before her death, given coca and chicha beer to keep her docile. And then she'd been walked up the mountain to the sacrificial site, dressed as a bride, and left to freeze to death as an offering to the mountain god. This was capacocha, the Inca practice of child sacrifice, and it was explicitly framed as marriage to the divine. The Spanish chroniclers documented this practice in disturbing detail. Bernabé Cobo, writing in History of the New World, 1653, based on interviews with elderly Incas who remembered pre-conquest practices, describes how young girls were selected for sacrifice. They chose the most beautiful girls, virgins of noble blood, between the ages of 10 and 15. These were called akulakuna, the chosen ones. They were taken to houses called akulahuasi, where they were raised in isolation, taught to weave fine textiles, to brew chicha beer, and to serve the gods. Some became priestesses or were given as wives to nobles, but the most beautiful, the most perfect, were reserved for the gods themselves. They were married to the gods through the ritual of capacocha, which meant their deaths on sacred mountains. The key phrase, married to the gods. This wasn't just sacrifice, it was ritualized as marriage. Garcilaso de la Vega, son of an Inca princess and Spanish conquistador, provides more detail in royal commentaries of the Incas, at 1609. The capacocha ceremony took a year to complete. The girl was treated as a bride-to-be, adorned with fine clothes and jewelry, fed special foods. Then she was taken in procession to the sacred mountain. The entire empire knew her name, her village, her family. She was celebrated as one who would become the bride of the Apu, the mountain god. At the summit, she was dressed in bridal garments and given chicha mixed with powerful herbs to make her sleepy. Then she was sealed in a stone chamber and left to die. The archaeological evidence confirms these accounts with horrifying precision. Since the 1990s, dozens of Capacocha burial sites have been discovered in the high Andes. The pattern is consistent. Children, usually girls, dressed in ceremonial clothing, showing evidence of months of special diet before death. The Lulailako children, studied extensively by Dr. Andrew Wilson at the University of Bradford, tell a detailed story through their preserved hair. Hair grows continuously and incorporates isotopic signatures of what a person eats. By analyzing different sections of hair, researchers can see diet changes over time. The 15-year-old girl, called La Doncella, the maiden, by researchers, showed evidence of a dramatic diet change starting about 12 months before death. She began consuming large quantities of maize and meat, foods reserved for the elite. 6 months before death, coca leaves appeared in her system, and not occasionally but constantly. She was being drugged to keep her compliant. In her final weeks, alcohol consumption increased dramatically. By the time she was walked up the mountain to die, she was likely too intoxicated to fully comprehend what was happening. But here's the truly dark part. She was being prepared as a bride. The textiles she wore were bridal garments. The silver pin she wore was a tupu, traditionally given to women at marriage. The placement of her body, hands folded, head covered, mirrors the traditional posture of an Inca bride. She was married to the mountain god, and the marriage was consummated through her death. Other Capacocha sites reveal similar patterns. At Mount Amparo, the site where Juanita, the Ice Maiden, was discovered in 1995, archaeologists found elaborate offerings surrounding the 13-year-old girl's body. Gold and silver figurines, textiles, food offerings. Among them, miniature figures of a male and female in an embrace, a symbolic representation of marriage. The Inca didn't hide this practice. They celebrated it. A quipu, knotted string record, preserved in the Museo Nacional de Arqueología in Lima, dated to around 1450 CE, records Capacocha ceremonies across the empire. The knots indicate 42 children sacrificed in a single year during the reign of Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui. The knot pattern suggests that 31 of them were girls, most between ages 10 and 15. The Spanish priest Cristóbal de Molina, writing in Relación de las Fábulas y Ritos de los Incas, 1575, recorded an interview with an elderly Inca nobleman who explained the logic. The Capacocha was the highest honor. The girl became a bride of the gods, a divine being. Her village received honors and tribute exemptions. Her family was elevated in status. The girl herself would live forever in paradise with the Apu as his bride. But did the girls see it that way? One piece of evidence suggests not. The Lulailako site contained 3 children. 2, the older girl and a younger boy, showed no signs of struggle in their final positions. But the youngest, a 6-year-old girl, was found with her hands clutching her burial wrappings, her face contorted. Analysis suggests she may have woken up from the drug-induced stupor as she was freezing to death. She was buried alive, essentially, and she fought it. The Incas described these children as willing brides of the gods. But how much choice does a 10-year-old girl have when her entire culture tells her this is her sacred destiny? When refusing means dishonoring her family and her village? When she's been drugged for months to keep her compliant? For the Incas, marriage was a contract with the gods, a contract that required a life to seal it. Young girls were dressed as brides, celebrated as the chosen ones, and then killed to maintain the favor of the divine. Their lives, from selection to death, shaped entirely by a system that valued religious obligation above human life. These sacred sacrifices weren't isolated. Marriage in ancient cultures often involved the ultimate price, life itself. And perhaps that's the darkest truth of all, that across civilizations, across centuries, across continents, marriage was so often about power, control, and sacrifice that death itself became just another wedding tradition. 25 stories, 25 ancient marriage customs that reveal a pattern so consistent it's impossible to ignore. Marriage, across cultures and centuries, was rarely about love. It was about power, control, property, politics, and violence. From the incestuous marriages of Egyptian pharaohs to the bride capture traditions of the Celts. From the commodification of women in Roman markets to the systematic abduction of conquered women by the Mongols, from child brides in ancient Israel to human sacrifice disguised as divine marriage in the Andes, the pattern repeats: women as property, women as political tools, women as sacrificial offerings. But here's what makes this pattern even more disturbing. These weren't secret practices hidden in shadows. They were legal, they were celebrated, they were defended as necessary for social order, religious purity, political stability, or divine favor. The very institutions that were supposed to protect people, law, religion, custom, instead systematized their exploitation. And it wasn't just primitive societies. The Romans, with their sophisticated legal codes and engineering marvels, traded women like commodities. The Greeks, who gave us philosophy and democracy, ritualized kidnapping as courtship. The Incas, with their impressive architecture and administrative systems, dressed children as brides and left them to freeze to death on mountains. Civilization didn't prevent these practices. In many cases, civilization enabled them. Writing systems documented them, legal codes codified them, religious texts justified them, administrative bureaucracies systematized them. The more advanced the civilization, often the more efficiently they could exploit women through marriage. Think about the voices we've encountered. The woman from Sumer who wrote to her brother, trying to maintain some connection to her stolen life. The Ptolemaic princess who dreamed of running away but knew there was nowhere to run. The Irish woman Gormleth, treated as defective merchandise in a legal dispute. The Capacocha victims, drugged and dressed as brides, walked up mountains to die. These weren't abstractions. These were real people. They had names, most of which we'll never know. They had families, dreams, fears. They lived in their own bodies, felt pain and terror and despair, and they were ground up in systems that treated them as less than human.